The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was wide and pale, and the next it was a wall of black cloud rolling in from the mountains like something alive and angry. The wind hit first, a hard, pushing wall of cold air that made the trees along the hillside bend low and groan. Then came the rain, heavy and sharp, falling sideways in thick sheets that turned the ground into mud within minutes. For most creatures the answer was simple. Find shelter. Get low. Stay still. But for a young dragon hatchling who had never flown through a storm before, there was no simple answer. There was only the wind and the dark, and the growing distance between her and the warmth of her clan. She had been flying at the back of the group the way young ones always did, tucked close behind the bigger bodies that blocked the worst of the air. It had been a long flight and she was tired, and perhaps that was why she had let herself drift a little too far to the side. Just a little. Just enough. The gust that hit her came from the left and it hit hard. It caught her small wings at exactly the wrong angle and flipped her sideways before she could correct herself. She tumbled, beat her wings frantically, and for one terrible moment she could see the rest of the clan pulling ahead through the rain, their dark shapes growing smaller and smaller as the wind carried her away from them. She called out. A sharp, high sound that she had never had to use before. No one turned back. They could not hear her over the storm. She understood that, somewhere in the back of her mind, but understanding it did not make the fear any smaller. She spun in the wind, fighting to level herself, fighting to gain any kind of height or direction. But she was small, barely 3 months out of the egg, and her wings were not yet strong enough to argue with weather like this. She stopped trying to fly and simply tried to land without dying. The ground came up fast in the dark. She could not see clearly through the rain and the wind was still pushing her sideways, so she had very little control over where she was going. She saw a fence, tried to clear it, clipped the top rail with her left wing, and felt a sharp burst of pain shoot from the joint down through the membrane. She cried out again, louder this time, and then she was tumbling again, rolling across something hard and flat. She hit something solid with her shoulder, bounced, and slid to a stop on a cold stone floor. Everything hurt. She lay still for a long moment, just breathing, listening to the rain hammer against the walls around her. She had gone through some kind of opening, a door left half open by someone who had not expected a storm, and she was now inside a large hollow structure that smelled strongly of metal and old oil and something else she could not name. She lifted her head slowly. The inside of the hangar was dark, but not completely. A thin strip of pale light came from somewhere along the far wall, just enough to show her the shapes around her. There were machines, big ones with thick arms and heavy bases, the kind of things that had no meaning to her at all. There were shelves along one wall stacked with objects she did not recognize. There were chains hanging from the ceiling and a long workbench cluttered with tools, and in the far corner, a small lantern that burned with a low, steady flame. She had no idea what any of it was. She only knew that she was out of the storm, and that nothing inside this place had moved toward her yet. She tried to stand and her left wing gave a sharp protest that made her hiss through her teeth. The pain from where she had struck the fence was real and deep, a heavy ache that ran from the joint outward. She folded the wing as carefully as she could against her side and tested her legs. Her back left claw was bleeding where it had scraped across the stone floor. Not badly, but enough that she could feel it with every step. She moved slowly toward the deepest shadow she could find. Behind the largest machine in the hangar, there was a dark gap between the metal base and the wall, just wide enough for her to squeeze into if she pulled her wings tight. She pressed herself into it and lay flat, her chin on the cold floor, her eyes watching the half-open door through which the rain was still blowing in small gusts. Nothing came through the door. The storm raged for a long time. She could hear it howling outside, throwing itself against the walls, rattling something on the roof. But inside it was just the low flame of the lantern, the smell of oil, and the cold. She did not sleep. She was too afraid to sleep. Every sound made her flinch, the creak of a beam, the rattle of a chain, the drum of rain on metal. She stayed flat and still and watched the door and tried to slow her breathing the way her mother had taught her to do when things felt too big. Hold. Out slow. Hold. Out slow. The storm began to ease sometime deep in the night, the rain thinning to a quiet drizzle, the wind dropping to something that simply moved rather than pushed. The lantern flame steadied. She was hurt and alone and very far from anyone who knew her name. She had no way of knowing that when the gray light of morning came creeping under the hangar door, it would come with the sound of footsteps. Slow, familiar footsteps. The footsteps of a man named Walter, who had worked in this hangar for more years than most people bothered to count, and who always arrived at the same hour, rain or shine, without fail. She had no way of knowing any of that. So she stayed in the dark and she waited and she shook. Walter arrived at exactly the same time he always did. The sky outside was still pale and wet from the night storm, and puddles had formed along the gravel path that led to the hangar door. He walked through them without bothering to step around them, the way a man does when he has stopped caring about wet boots a long time ago. He had a metal lunchbox in one hand and a small cloth bag over his shoulder, and he was already humming something low and wordless before he had even reached the door. He pushed it open, stepped inside, and stopped. He did not make a sound. He just stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the floor in front of him. The scratch marks were easy to see in the morning light. Long, uneven lines scraped across the stone, the kind that something with claws would leave if it had been sliding and scrambling in the dark. They came from near the door and moved inward, cutting across the floor toward the back of the hangar. Walter followed them with his eyes without moving his feet. They ended somewhere behind the big engine block in the far corner. He looked at his workbench next. 2 of his tools had been knocked to the floor. A wrench and a small-handled brush, both lying a few feet from where they should have been, as if something had bumped the bench hard while moving past it in the dark. A tin cup he used for washing small parts had been knocked over as well, rolling up against the base of the shelf on the left wall. Walter set his lunchbox down on the bench. He picked up the wrench and the brush and put them back where they belonged. He picked up the tin cup and set it right side up. He did this slowly and without any hurry, and while he did it, he was looking at the dark space behind the engine block in the way that a man looks at something when he is trying very hard not to look like he is looking. He had seen enough in his years to know that something was back there. He did not know what kind of something. It could have been a dog that had wandered in out of the storm. It could have been something larger. He did not know, and he did not go to find out. He had learned a long time ago that frightened things do not need people rushing toward them. Frightened things need space and quiet and time. He put on his heavy gloves and went to work. For the first hour he did what he always did: checked the machinery, tightened what needed tightening, made notes on a small pad about what needed attention. He moved around the hangar in his usual way, not avoiding the back corner but not going near it either, just working his way through his normal routine the way water works its way around a stone. He hummed while he worked. It was the same tuneless sound he always made, just a low and wandering hum that had no real melody to it, just something his throat did when his hands were busy and his mind was settled. He had hummed like that for as long as he could remember. His wife had once told him it was the most annoying thing about him, and then later said it was one of the things she missed most when he was away. He still was not sure what to make of that. Around mid-morning he stopped and opened his lunchbox. He had packed more than usual that morning, the way he sometimes did when he felt like the day might be a long one. There was bread wrapped in cloth, a hard-boiled egg, some dried meat that he had salted himself the week before, and an apple that was a little past its best but still good enough. He ate the egg and some of the bread standing at his bench. Then he took the rest of the dried meat and cut it into smaller pieces with his work knife. He did not make a show of it. He did not walk to the back of the hangar and crouch down and hold the food out like he was trying to coax something toward him. He simply walked over to the area near the engine block, not too close, and set the pieces of meat on the floor in a small loose pile. Beside it he placed the tin cup, which he had filled with clean water from the flask he always carried. He straightened up, looked at the dark gap behind the engine block for exactly 1 second, and then walked back to his bench. He did not say anything. He just picked up his tools and kept working. The hatchling had not moved since he arrived. She had watched him from the moment he walked through the door, her golden eyes tracking every movement he made, her body flat and completely still. She had been ready to bolt, or to fight if she had to, though fighting was the last thing she wanted with an injured wing and a bleeding claw. But he had not come toward her. He had not raised his voice or moved quickly or done any of the things that meant danger. He had just worked and hummed and moved around the hangar like she was not there at all. And then he had put food on the floor and walked away. She stared at the meat for a very long time. She watched him work through the afternoon. He never looked at her corner again. He just kept humming and fixing and writing things in his small pad, and outside the light moved slowly across the floor as the hours passed. By the time the light had gone orange and low and Walter had packed up his lunchbox and pulled off his gloves and put on his jacket to leave, the hatchling had made her decision. She waited until the hangar door had closed behind him. Then she crept forward, slow and careful, and ate every piece of meat on the floor. She drank the water too, all of it, and then sat very still in the quiet hangar for a long time. She did not understand humans. But this one, she thought, was something different. 3 days passed in the same quiet way. Each morning Walter arrived at the same hour, pushed open the hangar door, set his lunchbox on the bench and went to work. Each morning he left something near the engine block before he started. A piece of meat, a heel of bread, once a small pile of dried fish that smelled so strongly it filled the whole hangar within minutes. Each evening he left, and each evening without fail whatever he had left on the floor was gone by the time he came back the next day. He never commented on it. He never looked toward the back corner with anything more than a passing glance. He just kept arriving, kept leaving food, kept humming his low tuneless hum while he worked, as if this were simply part of his routine now and had always been. The hatchling had begun to move closer. Not much. Not enough that she thought he would notice. But each night after he left, she found herself sleeping a little further from the back wall and a little closer to the open floor. And each morning when he arrived, she was watching from a shorter distance than the day before. She told herself it was because the floor near the engine block was warmer. She told herself it had nothing to do with the man. She was not entirely honest with herself. On the fourth morning something was different. Walter came in as usual, set down his lunchbox, pulled on his gloves. But before he went to his bench, he paused near the center of the hangar and looked toward her corner. Not a quick glance. A real look, steady and calm, the kind that meant he had seen something and was thinking about it carefully. She had shifted position in the night. The pain in her wing had made it hard to stay curled on one side for too long, and sometime before dawn she had stretched out along the floor with her left wing half open, trying to ease the deep ache that had been sitting in the joint since the storm. She had not thought about the light. A thin beam of morning sun was coming through a crack in the roof and it fell directly across her, and her wing, the injured one with its bruised membrane and the small tear near the edge, was lit up clearly for anyone to see. Walter looked at it for a long time. She watched him, tense, ready to pull back into the shadows. But he did not step toward her. He stood where he was, just looking, and his face was the same calm face it always was. No alarm in it, no excitement, just the quiet expression of a man who was thinking something through. Then he turned and went to a cabinet on the far wall. He opened it and moved things around inside for a minute, and when he came back he was carrying a small wooden box. He walked to a spot about halfway between his workbench and her corner, not close, not far, just somewhere in the middle of the open floor, and he sat down. Not crouched. Not kneeling. He sat fully down on the cold stone floor, the way someone sits when they are planning to stay for a while, with his legs out in front of him and his back straight. He set the wooden box on the floor beside him and opened it. Inside were clean cloth strips, a small dark bottle and a soft brush with a thin handle. He did not look at her. He picked up one of the cloth strips and folded it slowly, the way a person does when their hands need something to do while they wait. He set it back down. He picked up the bottle and turned it in his fingers, then set it back. He was not performing for her, not trying to show her anything. He was just sitting there with his box open in the quiet. The hatchling watched him. Her wing ached. It had been aching since the night of the storm and it was not getting better on its own. She knew that now. The tear near the edge was small but it pulled whenever she moved wrong, and the bruising along the joint had gone from sharp pain to a deep, constant soreness that wore at her in a way that was hard to ignore. She had been trying to ignore it. She had not been doing very well. She looked at the cloth strips in the box. She looked at Walter, sitting still on the cold floor with his gloves off now, his large rough hands resting open on his knees. Not reaching. Not waiting in the tense way that meant something was about to happen. Just sitting, the way the hangar itself just sat, solid and quiet and not asking anything of her. It took a long time. She was not sure exactly when she decided. There was no single moment where she made a choice. It was more like the decision made itself, slowly, the way water finds its way through stone, not forcing anything, just following the path that was already there. She crept forward. One slow step, then another, then she stopped. Walter did not move. She came forward again, closer this time, close enough that she could see the lines on his face and the gray in his hair. She stopped again. He still did not move. Then she stretched her left wing out toward him. It hurt to do it. She made a small sound that she could not help, a low and quiet sound that was not quite a cry. Walter's eyes moved to the wing and he leaned forward very slowly, the way someone moves when they are trying not to startle a flame into going out. He worked without rushing. He cleaned the wound with the liquid from the dark bottle, which stung in a sharp bright way that made her flinch hard on the first touch. She pulled back slightly. He waited, hands still, until she settled. Then she stretched the wing toward him again and he continued. He cleaned every part of it carefully. He used the soft brush for the edges of the tear, gentle and precise. Then he took the cloth strips and wrapped the wing in slow, even turns, firm enough to hold but loose enough that she could still fold it against her side without it pulling. When he was finished he sat back and looked at his work for a moment. Then he got up off the floor with a low grunt, his knee again, and looked down at her with the same quiet face he always had. "There you go, little one," he said softly. Then he picked up his wooden box, walked back to his bench and went back to work. The hatchling sat on the floor in the middle of the hangar and looked at the white bandaging on her wing for a very long time. Outside, the sky was clear and blue and going nowhere. Ara had not slept. She had not slept in 4 days, not properly, not the deep and restful sleep that even the oldest dragons need when the nights grow long. She had been flying, searching the valleys and the ridgelines and the flat open land between the mountains and the sea, covering ground in long sweeping arcs that her younger scouts could barely keep pace with. She had not eaten much either. She had not felt like it. The hatchling was the youngest of the clan, the smallest, the one who had always flown at the back of the group because her wings were not yet strong enough to hold position anywhere else. Ara had always kept one eye on her during long flights. She had not kept a close enough eye. That thought had been sitting in her chest like a cold stone since the night of the storm. On the 4th night her scouts brought her a scent trail. It was faint, washed thin by the rain, but it was there, the warm and particular scent of a young dragon, carried on the wind from the direction of the human settlement at the edge of the valley. Ara had lifted off before the scout finished speaking. She did not wait for the others. She followed the scent line through the dark with her eyes half closed and her whole attention given to the thread of it, tracing it down from the hills and across the wet fields and toward the cluster of old buildings at the valley's edge. She found the hangar without difficulty. It was a long, low building with metal walls and an old roof that had gaps in it where the material had pulled apart over years of wind and weather. Light came from inside, a faint and steady glow from a small lantern somewhere in the corner. Ara circled it once, high and slow, reading the air around it. The hatchling scent was strong here. And underneath it, the scent of a human. One human, the same one, laid down in layers over several days. Ara circled again, lower this time. Through one of the wider gaps in the roof she could see the inside of the hangar clearly enough. What she saw made her slow her wing beats and circle a 3rd time, looking more carefully, making sure she was seeing it right. The hatchling was sleeping. She was curled on a folded piece of heavy canvas in the middle of the hangar floor, her tail wrapped loosely around herself, her injured wing resting along her side in a neat white bandage that someone had put there with care. Beside her on the floor was a tin cup of water and a small pile of dried meat, placed close enough that she could reach it without fully waking. She was breathing slowly, evenly, the breathing of something that felt safe. Ara stopped circling and found a high ridge of rock on the hillside above the settlement where she could land and watch without being seen. She folded her wings and sat in the dark and watched the hangar and did not move. The night passed slowly. Just before the sky began to lighten in the east, something changed inside the hangar. The hatchling shifted in her sleep, made a small sound and then settled again. The lantern flame moved in some draft from the gaps in the roof. Outside, the first birds began to make their early sounds in the trees along the hillside. Then came the footsteps. Ara heard them before she saw him. A slow and steady sound on the gravel path, the slightly uneven rhythm of a man with a knee that did not always cooperate. He came into view around the side of the building, a man of middle age with gray at his temples and a worn jacket and a metal lunchbox in one hand. He walked to the hangar door and pushed it open and went inside. Ara rose from the ridge without a sound and glided closer, dropping low until she could see through the roof gap again. The man had stopped just inside the door. He had not gone to his bench. He had not set down his lunchbox. He was looking at the hatchling, who had lifted her head at the sound of his arrival and was watching him with calm golden eyes. The man looked at her for a moment, the way he might look at something he was quietly glad to see, and then he walked over and crouched down beside her. He checked the bandage on her wing. Gentle, careful, 2 fingers pressing lightly along the edges to check that it was still sitting right. The hatchling let him do it without pulling away. Then he took the tin cup, saw it was empty and went to his flask to refill it. He set it back down beside her. He put a fresh piece of meat next to the cup. Only then did he take off his jacket and go to his bench. Ara watched all of it. She watched him settle into his work, heard the low hum he made without seeming to know he was making it. She watched the hatchling curl back down on the canvas, close but not too close to where the man worked, her eyes half open in the easy way of a creature that is resting but not afraid. Ara sat with what she was seeing for a long time. She was old enough to remember when humans and dragons had not looked at each other this way. She was old enough to remember when the space between their two kinds had been made entirely of distance and silence and the particular tension that lives between things that do not trust each other. She had lived inside that tension for so long that she had stopped expecting anything different. And yet here was a small and frightened hatchling, sleeping on a canvas bed that a human had made for her, with a bandage on her wing that a human had put there, eating food that a human left each morning without being asked and without wanting anything in return. Ara descended. She came down slow and steady from the pale morning sky, her great wings angled back, her silver jaw catching the first light of sunrise as she dropped toward the valley floor. She did not come in fast. She did not come in like something arriving to take or to confront. She came in the way a storm front comes, large and certain and impossible to miss, but moving at its own pace. She landed at the entrance of the hangar just as the sun broke fully over the eastern hills. Her shadow fell through the open doorway and crossed the entire floor of the hangar in one long sweep. The hatchling sat up immediately and made a sound, a high, urgent chirp, and scrambled to her feet. Inside something shifted. Walter had been bent over his workbench with his back to the door. He straightened up slowly. He turned around. And there was Ara filling the doorway the way a mountain fills a valley, completely and without any effort at all. Walter did not move for a long moment. He just stood at his workbench with his hands at his sides and looked at the creature filling his doorway. Ara was enormous. Her head alone was wider than the workbench he stood beside, and her shoulders nearly touched both sides of the hangar entrance. The morning light came from behind her and made her outline sharp and dark, but her eyes, those deep amber eyes, caught the light from inside the hangar and held it like two burning coals. Walter had never seen a dragon before. Not a real one. Not this close. He had heard stories the way everyone in the valley had heard stories, the kind that old men told around fires and that younger people mostly smiled at and forgot. He had never thought much about whether they were true. He was not the kind of man who spent a lot of time thinking about things he had not seen with his own eyes. Well, he was seeing with his own eyes now. He noticed that the hatchling had scrambled to her feet and was making her way toward the doorway, moving fast despite her injured wing, making a high urgent sound that he had not heard from her before. She reached Ara and pressed herself up under the great silver jaw, and Ara lowered her head just enough to breathe over her. A long slow breath that moved the hatchling's small scales and made the canvas on the floor shift like something had blown across it. They knew each other. That much was very clear. Ara's amber eyes came back up to Walter. He felt the weight of that look in a way he could not entirely explain. It was not like being looked at by an animal. It was not like being looked at by a person either. It was something in between or maybe something beyond both, the look of something very old and very aware, something that had seen enough of the world to know exactly what it was seeing and to make its own mind up about it. Walter did not look away. He also did not reach for anything. He did not back up toward the far wall or put the workbench between himself and the doorway. He just stood where he was, hands open at his sides, and held that amber gaze as steadily as he could manage. Ara stepped inside. The floor shook. Not violently, not the way it shook when the old engine was running badly, but a deep and solid tremor that Walter felt through the soles of his boots and up into his legs. She moved slowly, the way large things move when they are being deliberate about it, placing each foot with care. The hatchling stayed close beneath her jaw, still making small sounds, still watching Walter with those golden eyes. Ara looked around the hangar. She looked at the canvas bed on the floor. She looked at the tin cup and the small pile of meat beside it. She looked at the shelf on the wall and the tools on the bench and the lantern in the corner that was still burning its low steady flame. She took all of it in with the slow patience of someone reading something important and wanting to make sure they understood every word. Then her eyes went to the hatchling's wing. To the bandage. The clean white cloth wrapped in careful even turns from the joint outward, still sitting neatly, still doing its job. Ara lowered her great head toward it and breathed along the length of it, slowly, the way she had breathed over the hatchling in the doorway. She stayed there for a moment, reading it in whatever way dragons read things that matter to them. Walter watched her do this. Then he turned to his workbench and picked up the small wooden box. He carried it across the hangar floor toward her, not quickly, not slowly, just walking the way he always walked, steady and without fuss. He stopped a few feet in front of her and crouched down and set the box on the stone floor. He opened it and turned it so the inside faced her. The cloth strips. The dark bottle. The soft brush with the thin handle. Everything he had used still sitting in the box the way he always kept his things, clean and in their place. He did not say anything. He just left the box open on the floor in front of her and looked up at her face. Ara looked at the box for a long time. She looked at the cloth strips and the bottle and the brush. She looked at Walter's hands, still resting on either side of the open box, large and rough and marked with the kind of small scars and stains that come from years of working with tools and metal. Hands that had, at some point in the last 4 days, sat down on a cold stone floor and wrapped a frightened hatchling's injured wing with the same care those hands gave to everything else. The hangar was completely silent. Then Ara did something that made the hatchling go still. She lowered her head. Not just a dip, not just a small acknowledging tilt. She lowered it all the way, slowly and with great deliberateness, until the tip of her great silver snout nearly touched the stone floor in front of Walter's boots. Her eyes stayed open. She held the position for a long moment, her huge body utterly still, the only movement the slow rise and fall of her breathing. The hatchling had never seen this before. She had lived her whole short life inside the clan and she had never once seen Ara lower her head to anyone or anything. She did not fully understand the weight of what she was watching, but something in her went very quiet at the sight of it, the way young things go quiet when they sense that something around them is larger than they yet know how to measure. Walter looked at the great head lowered before him. He did not know what it meant. He had no way of knowing. He had no knowledge of dragon custom or dragon gesture or the centuries of meaning that lived inside a movement like the one Ara had just made. He only knew that something very large and very serious had just done something that felt, in his bones, like it mattered. He did what felt right. He reached out and rested his hand gently on the side of her snout. His palm against the cool, smooth scales just below her jaw. He did not pat. He did not grip. He just rested his hand there the way you rest a hand on the shoulder of someone who needed to know you were there. He looked up at those amber eyes, steady and close. "She's a tough little thing," he said quietly. "She'll be all right." Ara exhaled. It came out long and slow, a deep rumbling breath that moved through the whole hangar like a warm wind, lifting dust from the floor and making the lantern flame bend sideways for a moment. It was not a growl. It was not a warning. It was the sound of something that had been held tight for a long time finally being let go. The hatchling made a small soft sound and pressed against Walter's leg. He looked down at her, then back up at Ara, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was close to one. The expression of a man who has seen something he did not expect and finds, to his own quiet surprise, that he is glad he saw it. Above the hangar, through the gaps in the old roof, the sky was turning full gold with morning. And somewhere up in that gold light, the rest of the clan circled slow and silent, watching the open doorway below. They would remember this. All of them would remember this. The old man and his wooden box, the careful white bandage, the hand on the snout, the words spoken softly into the morning air of a small and oil-smelling hangar at the edge of a quiet valley. Some things do not need to be spoken in a shared language to be perfectly understood.